Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for our show. And I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor of a church here in the Pacific Northwest, and I've written a bunch of books and even taught philosophy for a time at the college level. But enough about me. How about you, Glenn? And then we'll kick it over to Tom.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and my main gig is as a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries.
All right, great. Tom, why don't you take it from here and tell us what we're talking about today?
All right. I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology and Christian ethics and philosophy and other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Today, we are talking about some of the ramifications of the virus or what have you that we all endured and caught and were plagued by in one way or the other. And really looking at an article by Hans Boersma. Some of you may know him from his work in theology and systematic theology in particular. He writes a lot on beauty and Christian Platonism, but he wrote an article called Viral Submission. This is in Touchstone. I think this was, do you have the journal?
Yeah, I've got it here. It's actually just a couple issues back. This was the June 2012 or 2022 edition. So May-June 2022. So just one or two issues back.
Yep. And so Viral Submission on the emerging totalitarianism of the new biopolitics. And so what I wanted to do is kind of get into that topic of this new totalitarianism by unpacking a little bit about what is meant when the word biopolitics comes up. Some of our audience may not be familiar with this term. We tend to hear about it a lot in the discussion of medical ethics in kind of, in theology and ethics classes. But first, the term bioethics. This really came into usage, if you will, out of the social sciences, and in particular, out of the thought of well, depending on what you think of, Michel Foucault, right? Michel Foucault's work.
The notorious Michel Foucault.
The notorious Michel Foucault. He was doing a lot of genealogical work. That means going back and looking at all the ways in which ideas and structures of society played into the development of maybe something that Charles Taylor would call the social imaginary, the way in which we think about certain things like life, our body, mental illness, why we think the way we do about these things. For him, he's a historicist, so there's no essences out there. There's nothing that really defines what life is. What nature is. It's really the byproduct of whatever kinds of configurations have led up to it socially and historically and the like. But for him, he does all of this work and he really comes to the modern period and he wants to look at the way in which the governing structures relate to the human person and the human person's biology, if you will, or biological life or embodied life. And so this is where this term comes into play. And so what it refers to is the way in which biopower or biopolitics is understood as the explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugations of bodies and the control of populations. That was a definition that came out of a textbook entitled Biopolitics and Utopia. So it refers to the explosion of the numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations. And this is a little technical too, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. It also is about the set of mechanisms through which the basic biological features of the human species become the object of political strategy. Long story short, the way in which governing powers find ways through technology and use of power to define, control, and basically turn into the object of their governing human bodies and human lives. So this is kind of what is going on here. Now, what we see when we look at kind of biopolitics today, for those that are analyzing it and kind of trying to critique it, if you will, is they notice that there has been a shift in classical ways in which society was structured, where you had a sort of sovereign that governed and kind of, had kind of a symbolic right, if you will, over the subjects that it governs over, the bodies. Say for the military, and then you sort of have a military hero. So it's okay to shed that blood for that society because it plays into, the whole and the legitimacy of that way of life. But what shifts here is a move away from any kind of sovereign and control to really the way in which the government starts to take on the interest of what is healthy and good for its citizens. And in some sense, all societies do this. Otherwise, you're not going to have a place for government. But it's really the increasing encroachment of it into almost the micromanagerial level, to the what you eat, the kinds of food you eat, the kinds of foods a population can eat in order to sustain it. What kind of things are harmful? Too many plastic bags, too many cups, and the like. It's the way in which they use statistics and science and medicine to basically govern, control, and dictate, if you will, what is going to be beneficial to how they understand the health of their subjects and what is in the best interest of their goals with the population. So that's kind of what biopolitics is about.
Yeah. Now, he makes an interesting distinction between this and Zoe, the word that in the New Testament is used for life in another sense. So bios, is the, term that would be used for a body, a physical body. But Zoe would be a term referring to the life of God, who is not embodied. Of course, in Christ, yes, but in terms of, a spirit who is the source of life, who is life itself, and the ability to think in that way is not at all even something that these people who think in these terms are able to entertain.
That's right. It tends to be either a very reductionistic picture, both for those practicing biopolitics and for those that are criticizing or analyzing it. Foucault has to do a lot of interesting work to come up with something to analyze, right? Because when you don't believe in real essences or kinds, you have to draw the line somewhere. And in order, so life gets kind of fuzzy, but really biological life or the health of the body, in very loosely defined, this can change because sometimes the health of one individual is okay to deteriorate if you're interested on kind of maintaining population. So health and life are going to kind of be variable, but you're exactly right. One of the problems with biopolitics, and I think, it is its understanding of life in such a way that's detached from the eternal, and therefore their program tends to try to push itself into those domains which the eternal otherwise would help govern the right way as we order life towards the right kind of flourishing and the right kind of goods for us. So we're going to see how this plays out. The article is going to talk about the way in which this plays out when you don't get the Zoe in the kind of eternal life picture emphasized.
Yeah, I think that's important to state, but also maybe it would be helpful for folks to sort of know as well that in the classical view, as we see expressed in the New Testament, it's not as though these things are completely unrelated.
That's right.
Bios is in some sense dependent upon Zoe.
Yeah.
When you lose Zoe, now it really is something that's entirely within our scope. Bios is, it's, in other words, political biopolitics is now possible, or at least in the mind of a person like Foucault, because that's the only thing that governs life. Is it's just us chickens here and nobody else. But if we're talking about the classical understanding, the Christian understanding, the ambit, the aspiration, the hubris of the modern outlook is foolishness to attempt to control life in the way that we try to now.
That's yes.
Now what you have to remember is with Foucault, the only thing, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but the only thing that's really real is power relationships.
Yes.
All language is a game that really revolves around power in different forms. Everything else in society is all about power. It's a very reductive system. So when asking questions about health, Foucault's natural direction is who's got power.
Yeah. And interestingly, even with that narrow scope and even with his leanings, he ends up becoming something, I think, especially through one of his kind of, the students of his school, Giorgio Agamben, I think that's how you say his name, is really this is the kind of left that is criticizing the way in which kind of liberal modern states are actually enforcing and suffocating and subjugating. So, and one of the things that is going to show up here, I don't want to get there too quickly, but you're going to see with Agamben in particular, his criticism that the kind of new left, if you will, has been hijacked by this kind of, this liberal modern state, and is basically serving the ends for which the Foucaults of the world and he himself were trying to say, this is not good territory. This is going to actually be turning you into slaves of the totalitarian, emergent totalitarianism. So a lot of this, though, does depend on some of it, the analysis that grows out of these schools. And a lot of it, of course, is driven by, that typical left-wing hatred of anything capitalistic. But on the flip side, they're noticing similar things that people who are just committed to their lives ordered towards those good ends of creation, their family lives, making a living, trying to sustain life in those creaturely goods towards their fulfillment ultimately of both of their natural life, but also of its fulfillment in God, for example. And so one of the things that I think Boersma is trying to get to is the way in which a more recent sort of Foucaultian, Agamben, in his little 221 book, Where Are We Now? The Epidemic as Politics, he really shed light on the fact that what we've created with this pandemic is exactly what their fears were, where biopolitics ends up. And that is this kind of emerging totalitarianism. And one of the things he says at the beginning, he says, fear of catching a virus, right? And fear of death, for that matter, is irrational and caused us to elevate bare life, bios, if you will, above any consideration of the particularities of our life, what he calls bios. In other words, we've lifted just merely surviving because we have our biological health, right? We don't have the virus or we're to the place that we're actually denying all of those other aspects that make health a genuine thing in the full sense, not being lonely, not being isolated. And so this is kind of one of the first critiques, the way in which we allowed ourselves to basically be flooded by the biopolitics, to basically allow our lives to be cut off in the name of health from what is really healthy and flourishing.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of sort of collateral damage, and that's becoming less and less deniable. there's just been a lot of denial, a refusal even to talk about the collateral damage, people dying of loneliness, businesses, failing, and people committing suicide, all these different things. Or they actually feed the narrative in a weird way. Isn't it just so awful that the virus has had all these unintended or these ancillary consequences? No, it's not the virus. It was your stupid, policies that created these problems that these people are dealing with. But the people are so fixated and unable to sort of understand that their good intentions actually had terrible consequences, that they can't even hear or accept that kind of stuff. I think related to this is in the church, how many leaders in the name of love, for example, the loving thing to do is to mask. The loving thing to do is to get the jab. The loving thing to do is this and yada, yada. And it just never ends. It's the loving thing to do is not have worship. The loving thing to do is stay in your house. To
not go by the bedside of the family, or not allow the family to be at the bedside of someone already dying.
Yeah, that would be the loving thing to do. So this kind of violence that was committed against just common sense language, is again another sort of strange feature to this. And I think where you're driving here, Tom, is that this biopolitical sort of outlook has taken on this sort of well, it's not even communitarian. It's downright socialistic and communal character, where the rights of people to order their lives are completely ruled.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And I'm going to get to that point because he gets there in the article with the church part. And I'll probably get to that pretty quickly. But I do want to note that one of the ways in which biopolitics is kind of spelled out a bit more in Biopolitics and Utopia, the book, it talks about since the formation of the modern state system, and they're talking about what we're dealing with now, especially its global connections, governments have sought to exercise greater control over the lives of its citizens, the bodies of its citizens. And so you have entire disciplines of studies, statistics, demography, epidemiology, public health, that have arisen as highly politicized forms of knowledge. Making the possibility and the ability to better analyze and regulate individuals and society as a whole, and involving processes of correction, normalization, disciplining, therapeutics, optimization. And then there is also the flip side about the way in which it intervenes with our human bodies, in terms of especially in terms of, how many children people should be having, whether they should be having them. I mean, we're seeing with the transgender issue we'll get to, in the way in which the normalization of affirming care and its basic top-down biopolitical pressures in school systems to start having kids wrestle with this earlier and earlier. So this biopolitical it's moved into almost in a as what he uses the term in terms of fascism, into every domain of our lives. And he actually calls it a section in the article of Boersma, a giant makeover, where he's quoting again Agamben. He's quote, "Never before, not even under fascism and during 2 world wars, has the limitation of freedom been taken to such extremes. People have been confined to their houses, deprived of all social relationships, reduced to a condition of biological survival. This barbarity does not even spare the dead. Those who die are being deprived of their right to a funeral, their bodies instead being burned." And so this is really one of the things that I think just shook Agamben, but also he wants to turn around and shake us a little bit to make us realize what we just went through.
Yeah, I mentioned last time that I'm reading this book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism by Matthias Desmet. And what he is really helpful with is, in a couple of respects, this biopolitics and how it, on the one hand, is actually not as informed as it presents itself as being, repeatedly correcting itself. It doesn't have a grip on the physical world like it claims to. So it in order to suppress its own insecurity with regard to its lack of knowledge, it prevents anyone from dissenting. It just shuts them up. And then he also notes that, and this is where history is so important. So many of the things that we look back at with 2020 vision, things like like fascism and communism, in the moment, in their early stages, they were the sort of like kind of inevitable triumph of the scientific approach over the vagaries of life, and even morally valorous. So for example, with and this is one of the things that Desmond brings out. He says, with regard to the Bolsheviks, with the communist revolution in Russia, the Bolsheviks cried foul because the Tsar, under his regime, had executed 17 people the previous year before the revolution. 17 people died. In the first year that the Bolsheviks took over, that number had greatly increased. And by the 1930s, we were talking about hundreds of thousands of people being put to death by these people who, in the first phase of their project, were, railing against the Tsar because of his inhumanity. That's so you have to keep that in mind. It's not as though totalitarianism declares itself, in all of its brutal force, right? As it's getting underway, it can, in order to sustain its illusion of total control. It has to become more and more ambitious and radical in its scope, and that's what a lot of people who said, watch out where this stuff with coronavirus is going to take us. And people would say, slippery slope, fallacy, yada yada yada. Yeah. But we saw it just in the short period of time we were, able to witness what we did witness.
Well, whenever you find someone who's a utopian, like the Bolsheviks, you have a totalitarian. And what we see in biopolitics is a kind of medical utopianism. We are going to eradicate the virus. We're going to have 0 cases. That's China's goal. We're going to have 0 COVID. We are going to do something that has never been done in human history before. We are going to find a way to control the spread of a respiratory virus so that it will not infect people. That's never been done before. But because you have this utopian vision, utopias are always totalitarian because any dissent threatens the coming utopia.
Yeah.
So what you saw in COVID, I would argue, is that attempt at this horrendous utopian impossibility. And by pursuing that, we had all of the collateral damage, which is still unacknowledged because they're still trying to find a way to the utopia.
And it's still not acknowledged in much of evangelicalism at the highest levels. There is, I have yet to hear a single person of any sort of significance within the evangelical big E of the world say I was wrong. I shouldn't have gone along.
Yeah. And I think you're going, something I want to get back to is really the church's place in all of this, and the few outliers, like the Polish charismatic guy up in Canada who
was right.
One of the bold heroes out there during this time who because he comes from enough of a background and familiarity of this stuff. But one of the things Boersma talks about is kind of the knee-jerk reaction. And I think for everyone, before we even understood what was happening and the way it was presenting and people just dropping dead everywhere and you don't even know how to digest it, that makes sense. But he says the knee-jerk reaction to the epidemic has nearly been universal. Fearful concession to political power, to health authorities, and a serf-like compliance with political overreach in terms of religious freedoms, freedom of expression, like we were just talking about, the way in which you're censored if you disagree with, taking the vaccine or you have questions about it, freedom of movement, and then, of course, what is still not acknowledged, and I do await an apology from one of the universities I teach at, these vaccine mandates, which I wasn't allowed to teach on campus, even though they were happy to have me while there was no vaccine, put my life at risk for their benefit. So, and basically just on that level, the way in which a questionable, the science, it doesn't matter what you think. I mean, people who have been vaccinated and boosted and everything else have gotten it. I mean, look at Biden now. He's second time in, and their whole point is, well, you won't get it as bad. Well, many people don't get it as bad and haven't been vaccinated. So, again, this is kind of heresy. To say these things, could even mean jail in some cases, in some places. And
that doesn't even get into the sudden creation or sudden development of sudden onset adult death.
Oh yeah, and healthy young adult death.
Sudden adult death syndrome. So it's SADS as opposed to SIDS. Yeah. And the number of athletes that have died after getting the jab and all of that kind of thing. I mean, correlation is not causation. There are always a certain number of deaths. And, okay, so this year there is more, but there's no proof that it's anything to do with the vaccine. You haven't even examined it.
Yeah. Well, if it's correlation doesn't mean causation, then it's the same thing about it working. Right. Right. I mean, that can work both. Causality can work and correlation can work both ways. But this is one of the things I think that, the concern, interestingly, came not from an evangelical so much, other than maybe one or two outliers, and a lot of us who started to be troubled by what was going on, but really felt powerless in many ways to put a spoke in the wheel of anything. But it takes someone from the Foucault left to basically poke a hole in the tire and say, wait a minute, lefties. You've basically given yourself, just so you can have center stage in part of this biopolitics, over to this scientism as a religion. And for all of our years of being outliers, of criticizing science as functioning as if it's a religion, here you are basically subscribing to it. And not just you lefties, but look at you evangelicals and you Christians. Shouldn't you have known better? And so he's got this little quote at the back. He says, let's start with Boersma. He says, perhaps the most distressing for a Christian reader are Agamben's legitimate barbs at the church. As Christians, we have mostly stood on the sidelines as we treated each other primarily as spreaders of a contagion. And that's one of the things that is, according to, Agamben and others, part of what the biopolitics wants to create, that everyone is almost, a contagion and someone you should stay away from and basically be mediated through our social, agenda. And so you have this allowing the aged to languish in care homes, and oftentimes in New York, sending the sick there to kill them off, refusing last rites to the dying, and meekly consenting even to funeral prohibitions. And this is a quote by now a handmaiden of science, right? No longer is philosophy a handmaiden of theology or science. It's the reverse. Now a handmaiden of science. The latter have become the true religion of our time. The church has radically disavowed its most essential principles. led by a Pope named Francis. It is forgetting that Saint Francis actually embraced lepers. It is forgetting that one of the works of the church is mercy and mercy values in visiting the sick. And it is forgetting the martyr's teaching that we must be willing sometimes to sacrifice life rather than faith, and that renouncing one's neighbor means renouncing one's faith. I think that was a pretty sweeping critique. I'd let you guys run with that a little bit, your impression.
Yeah, one of the things, I think we did a show on this when COVID first broke out. One of the things that has been true of the church historically is that when everybody else was running out, the church was running in. When there was a plague, when there was pretty much any kind of problem, the church was always there to work. When you get to the Reformation in particular, but even earlier, you have people saying, all right, you take all wise, look at Luther, take all wise steps, all the advice of the doctor for your personal care. But if you are a pastor and someone in your congregation needs you, you go whatever the doctors say, because that is your calling. You're responsible to go there and minister to that person. And, so the question that we have to ask, the question that I keep coming back to nowadays, I wish I'd articulated this as clearly in slang Leviathan. Jesus tells us to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and to give to God what's God's. When we've got a situation like this, shouldn't we be asking the question, is this something that belongs to Caesar? Historically, it belonged to God. It belonged to the church to go out and minister to these people, whatever the risk. And yet somehow the state says, oh, no, you can't take the risk for a respiratory infection that people in the past took for plague.
Yeah, I think part of that, Glenn, is kind of the ambition that we have tied back to this ideology of science and its efficaciousness to address every problem. It requires us to sort of track every variable and every person and control them, so that we have the kind of power, providential power, that historically has been only understood as possible for God. So we aspire to displace God in this role of providentially ordering all things because we don't trust God's providence. We take it upon ourselves to supplant his place and order things, according to our own lights. You remember that IBM campaign a few years back, A Smarter Planet? This idea that somehow the planet wasn't smart enough or didn't have any sort of inherent wisdom that ordered it, that consequently we had to kind of provide a layer of digital organization in order to make the planet smart. I don't know if anybody really picked up on just how blasphemous that is, but I thought it was terrible from the start. But I think it all kind of ties into this ambition to control every variable. So it's not so much, Glenn, that they were concerned about me. Maybe they were, but they were concerned that after I visited so and so, I would come back home and give it to some people there, and then they would give it to people elsewhere. That kind of thing. And the only way that they believed that they could prevent that was by taking over my life and preventing me from exercising my own, competence.
But the writer is Italian. They're Catholic there.
Right.
So do you mean to tell me that the risk of you potentially, as a priest who doesn't have family, that the risk of you spreading that to some other people, that risk is worth the damnation of someone's soul?
Yeah.
Because in Catholic theology, you don't get last rites. That's a real possibility.
Yeah.
Well,
What belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar? Now, I may disagree with Catholic theology on this, but you got to ask the question.
Well, and if we're focusing on the thinking of the Catholic hierarchy, then you're absolutely right. I was thinking more in terms of the thinking of the secular authorities.
Right. And I understand that. They're concerned with bios. We're concerned with the real Zoe, not what the article has for Zoe. But again, the question keeps coming back to what belongs to God as opposed to belonging to Caesar.
And I think
people's souls belong to God.
Yeah. But I think the great revealer, if you will, especially of the church, is jumping on board with the biopolitic, if you will. I think with Peter Leithart, that's where I really first started to hear kind of resistance to biopolitic, where he said, no, I think he was writing in First Things. He said, you know what? No, I'm not getting the vaccine. I'm actually doing this as a spiritual resistance to biopolitics. And at the time, I was like, "What is he on to?" I knew the stuff from the bioethics and the like, but I hadn't made the connection there. But I think you are starting to see some figures catch on very quickly that something dark is going on here, and it is in people in the name of health and their own safety, their own continuance of their biological life, are willing to do almost anything that compromises higher purposes and virtues that we're meant to indwell and embody. And so I think, we could pick any of the virtues. I think one he picks here is a good one. Mercy values and the showing of mercy. In classical ways of thinking about the formation of the human being, there could be philosophical or it's Christian version. We are to be the kind of people being formed to move, as Glenn said, to run into this rather than away from it. And so the values, the habits of mercy, of learning to practice mercifulness, in ways grounded in grace and the Spirit, create a different kind of people than those who think, okay, I can do yoga while I'm, here. I don't need to go to church. I can, focus on my self. And I think one of the things I'm starting to be convinced of is that we almost universally in the West have a fundamentally non-Christian conception of the human being. It is one that is the construct of moves away from the Christian conception. And so really our health and well-being by itself, ourself, is the core sacred issue, and not higher goods, much less having to care for another self. It only became politically expedient when it was, you need to submit to this. That's your way of being concerning the whole body, the whole social body.
Yeah, and yet, if you look at the traditional works of mercy, most of them come straight out of Jesus's words, "Come blessed of my Father, yours is the kingdom prepared for you." Feeding the hungry, giving water to the thirsty, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, visiting those in prison. I think there are two more, one of which is burying the dead.
Yeah.
I think they're usually in sevens. That's only 6. So there's probably another one that I'm missing. But those are the classic works of mercy as understood within Catholic theology, probably in the Orthodox world as well. And yet here we are told you can't do that.
Well, isn't it
fascinating? You can't visit the sick. You can't bury the dead.
Isn't it fascinating that this lefty is disappointed in the fact that we didn't stay true to our own convictions, and was, I guess, of the opinion that at least those guys will resist, and then lo and behold, we don't. Now, we've brought out the fact that there were some people who did. You mentioned Leithart. We know a number of people, but you could say we're part of that community. What is it about some folks that makes it possible for them to resist? I've been thinking about this a little bit. I think
I grew up in New Jersey.
Yeah, that's right. Just having that, but would you say that everybody from New Jersey was on that same side of the issue with you, Glenn?
Well, there are real New Jerseyans, and they're just people who happen to live in New Jersey.
There you go. But maybe there is something to what you're saying, even though I know you're joking, in terms of how you understand yourself. I don't go along with this kind of stuff. I never do. Now, for me, as I think back upon my journey on this issue, and like a lot of folks, I was like, I don't know what's going on. I have to take the word of people. I see these reports from Italy and from China. This thing's got to be just awful. Yeah. And so I actually, in the first phase of things, said, let's support the authorities. They're trying to serve our interests. But about a month and a half in, about 2 months in, I was like, this is not. There's something funny. There's something funny about all this. I don't know about this. And I saw a number of other people who I was connected with who were feeling the same way and were taking some steps. And then I took some steps. And anyway, but there were people, there are people even at this point who cannot entertain the possibility that this was handled terribly. It wasn't as bad as everybody made it out to be in the media, and consequently, still look at you and me and three of us and the people that we identify with or consider fellow travelers on this issue as dangerous and as people who don't love anybody.
Yeah. And you take a look at Sweden.
Yeah,
you got concrete proof it didn't work. Yeah, it was unnecessary. Yeah, and all that collateral damage was completely unnecessary.
Yeah, and they avoided a lot of that collateral damage. And of all people, we've talked about this, of all people, would we have said Sweden would have held out? No, none of us. We would have all said they would have been the worst of the worst, but they weren't. But you see, that gets to my point. It doesn't kind of come down to some of the markers that we thought it would come down to. Yeah. Some of the people who are the strongest advocates of, say, traditional authority structures were incredulous and resisted. So what is it about some people and who were able to smell a rat early and say, I'm not going along?
I don't have a good answer to that. All I can tell you is that, I remember standing up in class and saying, this COVID thing, I am the only person in this room who actually has they knew early on what the risk factors were.
Yeah.
I said, I'm the only one in this room who's got the risk factors. And one guy immediately jumps in and says, yeah, but if I bring this home and give it to my grandmother.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that now I see, there are still people here every day in the grocery stores and everything else, younger people too, masked up and really it is incredible. Just get the plastic bubble suit from Boy in the Bubble, remember?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Now maybe one of the markers, and maybe this is why, the situation with Sweden was so perplexing in terms of the circles that I'm familiar with. The more progressive your politics, the more likely you are to be just a complete tool when it comes to this stuff.
Because progressive politics is built around the government knows best.
But I remember progressives. I'm thinking about the old crunchy folks from up in Vermont.
Oh, that's they're a different breed.
But that's what I'm getting at. So that's the thing.
Yeah, well, that's always surprised me too. But in the way, but you can find Neil Young and other hippies that kind of you'd think were always the anti-establishment running to this kind of. I think I remember. Wasn't it Neil Young?
Yeah.
He canceled his music on Spotify because it shared it with
Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan
for even questioning this. I mean,
he's back, by the way.
Brain.
He came back on.
Yeah, he's back.
He was losing too much money, I think.
Yeah, well, that was it, and he didn't say he didn't say I'm sorry or I was wrong or anything. These people are total frauds.
I saw one guy, I think he was a punk rocker, who said something to the effect of, I never thought I would live long enough to see the day that the Republicans were the ones who were resisting the government.
Yeah, right. you know who I think that may have been, wasn't he the singer Sid Vicious or
Sid
Johnny
Vicious,
Rotten?
Yeah.
Johnny Rotten.
It was one of them.
Yeah, one of them's dead. The other one, I think Johnny Rotten. Yeah, I think so. And interesting. Lawrence Fox over in UK, very similar actor. He was, Inspector Lewis, and he's really taking them on it. It is interesting. Well, I found a little basically book review of someone who wrote a book in response to critiquing Agamben's book. Another guy from the left who basically wants to critique the leftism of Agamben with the kind of veneration, the left's new veneration of scientific expertise and technocratic rule. So what you're starting to see is this kind of breakup. I mean, as we're seeing the kind of old alignments breaking up under pressure. And he goes out and basically writes a book saying that basically Agamben is his book was called The Revenge of the Real, and it was anything but the real. It was defending masks and everything else. But at the end of the day, the reviewer who reviewed this guy's book, let me tell you the name of it. The book was called The Revenge of the Real, written by Benjamin Bratton, who is basically a brat. But the whole thing was basically around just criticizing anyone who would question the scientific expertise and the rule of physicians in medicine on this as basically quack Trump supporters. And the whole book is nothing but ad hominem abusives. And his whole savior is, what he calls the epidemiological politics, a new form of biopolitics.
See, now the thing is, this is completely 100% predictable.
Yeah.
Because the left, okay, I think I've said this before on the show, but systems of government and economic systems parallel each other. Yeah. This is why democracy goes with representative government. It's also why socialism and the left always goes to technocracy.
Yeah.
And so it is not at all surprising that people who are on the left and who are against all of the stuff in the government when they weren't in power, as soon as they get in power, they run hard toward technocrats.
Yeah.
Because it is the logical implication of their system. The government knows best. We know how to order your life. We know how to order the economy. We can guide these things and guide all things to their best ends because we are the experts. This is the core of what the left is about.
Yeah. Yeah. And and I think one of the things, I mean, there's an interesting article by Patrick Deneen called Biopolitical Tyranny. This had more to do with the movement of the biopolitical into human sexuality and the notion of marriage and the like. And one of the things he's quoting here was what I thought was one of John Milbank's actually finer moments. He is a lefty, and I think he gets a lot of things wrong. A lot of what is going on, what he calls the kind of liberal state, is really the lefty state. And so he's a different kind of lefty, influenced a lot by Foucault and the like. But one of the things he was talking about when the issue of gay marriage came up, especially in Europe and UK, he wrote something pretty fascinating that he said basically, Milbank writes, where the reality of sexual difference is denied, then it gets reinvented in perverse ways, just as the over-sexualization of women and the confinement of men to a marginalized machismo, right? But he says, he's talking about this change in marriage would end the public legal recognition of a social reality defined in terms of the natural link between sex and procreation. In direct consequence, the natural children of heterosexual couples will then be only legally their children if the state decides that they might be legally adopted by them or by the state. And I think we're also seeing this encroachment tyranny move in as we're starting to see now the school systems underwritten by the state, coming in and basically saying, if your child who doesn't necessarily legally, you have no more rights because it's your biological child than anyone has legally, and that legal right now is granted by the state alone, not any kind of order of nature in law around that. So therefore, if the child wants to decide its own gender, and the parents, the biological parents, have a problem with this, well, then the state, in a sense, can adopt. It can override the rule because that biological relationship, that procreative, have been eliminated out of the definition. And his point later was that this has been the strategic move of the modern state's drive to assume direct control over the reproduction of population, bypassing our interpersonal encounters. It never really was about gay marriage. It never was.
Yeah, I think that people who are watching the sort of the progress, so to speak, of these trends are making that connection now. That's that the state is essentially at odds with every other kind of mediating structure in society. And it's a total gambit to acquire the authority necessary to overrule every other institution and have direct access to every individual in isolation.
Yeah, the great irony of this is that the left is enamored with the United Nations. The United Nations Charter for the Rights of the Child says that the child has the right to a relationship with both the mother and the father, thereby undermining the entire thing of gay adoption, surrogacy, all of those kinds of things, as well as the authority of the state stepping in and taking that away. Right. But somehow nobody seems to have noticed this.
Yeah, I guess people have not availed themselves of that language in order to use it against Western, institutions or Western states. But maybe that's something that should be, pursued, attempted.
Well, and what you get here is that kind of that, again, what we've been talking about, the difference between those that recognize this natural link, right, and the good of this created order, even in its fallen state, nevertheless, for common grace or however one's going to spell that out, versus those who see all of this to be transcended and remade. A utopia, if you will, through science, through technology, and through power. And so they sell the promise that we've got your health taken care of, you're safe if you follow our rule and our dictates, and we will be there for you to make you, through technology or science and medicine, into anything you want to be. You're free, you have a freedom in this world of science and technology. And we're going to protect you from all of those that are attached to the real, because the real is not binding. It is nothing more than the raw material that we get to play with the way we want. Proof is, look what we just did with redefining marriage. But the thing is, I think, Chris, a point you made earlier, I think in this show, where you were talking about and mentioning how much, and this is where the encroachment of totalitarian takes over, how much omniscience and omnipotence it's going to take to be able to fight reality and its the kinds and their move towards their given natures, to actually think you're going to fight the created order and win.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and every defeat is only justification for the sort of more ambitious pursuit of the things that you don't yet control. You can always blame it on something that wasn't fully in your power. So therefore, hand it over. You know where this all goes.
A long time ago, when I was in grad school, there was a car that had a bumper sticker. It was an environmentalist bumper sticker, but I think it still applies here in other contexts. It said, "Nature bats last."
That's right. And it always hits the grand slam.
And it's always a slugger. I mean, that's the problem with all of these things. Nature bats last, and it's a slugger.
Yeah. The Promethean drive to master nature, I think, is just kind of in an ongoing kind of case of denial when it comes to your point there, Glenn. I think the prospect is, we start with fire, we'll end with, understanding the genome. Just think about the things that we've been able to do, which are impressive. I mean, split the atom, sequence the genome. We really do know a lot, but we know just infinitesimally, small amount of what there needs to be known in order to have the kind of power and of efficaciousness that God possesses. It's just, it'll always be beyond us.
The sane way of understanding things, if you are in higher education, is that the more you learn about your subject, the more you realize you don't know. And the thing that is probably most disturbing in one respect about all of this is the absolute lack of epistemic humility on the part of the experts.
Yeah. This book I've mentioned a few times by Desmond gets into this. He says that the real scientists, sort of the scientists who are, pursuing pure science, in the classical understanding, tend to be humble. They tend to be circumspect. It's the technologists, it's the engineers, it's the guys who are working with the discoveries of other people and trying to find practical, ways to apply them, who have this utopian sort of hubris that we've been critiquing.
It's interesting on that note. You probably know of Christopher Thompson's book that's come out recently, The Joyful Mystery. Field Notes Towards a Green Thomism is the name of it.
I heard an interview with him.
Yeah, very. I think Mars Hill did, if I'm correct. Very good interview. But one of the things that he gets, and this is one of the things I get so tired and sad that so many of the debates in the reform world of whether we should have some Thomas or not really don't read and get the beautiful wisdom and limits of any theologian of the church. And rather than seeing what they had to say in the light of Christ, they just bracket it all out as error, but their simple biblicism is profound truth and the only amount of truth you can have. And it's really sad. Secondly, Thomism isn't one thing. Anybody who knows or has looked into Aquinas and the byproduct of his theology knows that there is analytic Thomism, there's transcendental Thomism, there is Platonic there's Aristotelian. There is not one thing. That's because he was holistic and all-encompassing. He engaged every area of life and tried to shine the light of Christ on it. Take him or leave him. I'll leave it there. But anyway, this book is very beautiful. And one of the things he's talking about in this book is something that said basically the green people see something, the green movement see something, but they don't see it the right way, as Paul tells us, that there is truth that we can fathom, but we distort it and we don't get to see it. But when it gets contemplated the right way, ultimately through the light of Christ, one begins to see similarly what the scientist sees. As you get closer to things in creation, they become more profound, more beautiful, more mysterious, and yet also they start to communicate their intelligibility. This is what Aquinas was up to with his metaphysics of creation, that when God made kinds and orders them to fulfill certain ends, be procreative, be fruitful and multiply. As one begins to unpack the mystery and beauty of that process, its intelligibility communicates. It communicates, and that actually communicates something of the creator as well. And so, and I think it's that way. Scientists or anyone who works in any field of knowing or familiarity with an instrument or art knows mystery only increases as the intelligibility of the created world manifests, I would say, the glory of God in it.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to kind of bring us to a conclusion there, Tom. Is there anything you want to say as we wrap up here, Glenn?
No, I think I've probably said too much already.
Well, we want to say a few things at the close here. We want to say, first of all, thank you to the folks who support our show. We have people who support us in the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network. We have people who support us directly in various ways. We have Patreons on Patreon. And if you'd like to learn more about how to support us through Patreon, you can follow the link in the show notes that will take you to our Patreon page. I also want to say that when this show comes out, it'll only be maybe 2 or 3 weeks till the big conference that we're hosting here in the Battleground area in Washington with Aaron Wrenn and James Wood and Joe Rigney. And if you'd like to learn more about that, Negative World, the conference Negative World, or Welcome to Negative World, you can go to negworldconference.com, www.negworldconference.com, and learn about that. Anyway, that's all I've got to say at this point about those things. So if you guys don't have anything else to say, we can say bye-bye.
Bye.